All right, well, thank you so much for being here on this chilly day, or it's chilly with where I am, not sure about everyone else. But my name is Caity Bente. I am the Assistant Director of the Program for Instructional Excellence at Florida State University. As Tom mentioned, I have my bachelor's degree in psychology and my master's in the Instructional Systems and Learning Technologies degree program. So a lot of my experience has to do with, some teaching, some training design, some consultation services for teachers, things like that at Florida State. So just to give us a little bit of a framework for how today's session will function, I'll be going through a single case study, one particular project that I took the lead on for Florida State. And I like to use this particular instructional design project because it is a good example of a non-ideal scenario. And what I mean by that is we were quite limited, had a lot of different constraints that we were working with throughout the design process, and we were still able to deliver a product that was high quality and that was very well received by our learners. So it, I think, does a good job of showing what you can do even when you have a lot of limitations on your resources. So as we go through today, I'll talk about our reflections on the process and some tips that you can take away as an educator and as an instructional designer across various fields. We'll talk about various strengths that we retained from both the process and the product itself for future iterations of the project. We'll talk about some areas that we revised and improved and how we made those revision decisions. And we'll talk about some specific instructional design strategies that were helpful throughout the entire training development process. But to give us a few specific learning objectives, we will explore topics such as examining the ADDIE process in action. I saw quite a few questions that came in about the webinar that mentioned an interest in ADDIE, and I think this project is pretty good for really bringing that model to life off of the textbook page and into the real world. We'll talk about identifying our high priority subject matter experts as well as other key content for our training. Both collecting training content and making design decisions when time, funding, and other resources were quite limited to us, and pinpointing that relevant feedback so that we know what we did well and what we can improve upon in future iterations. I will also be sure to leave some time for questions at the end. I don't have any pressing meetings after this, so I'm happy to stick around and chat with a few of you if you'd like. So I'd like to start us off by first defining what is my program. My program is the Program for Instructional Excellence, also known as PI at FSU. I have the mission statement of our program here on the slide. But just to give a quick summary, we provide both mandatory training and ongoing professional development, specifically for graduate student teaching assistants at FSU, so graduate students who are funding their education by taking on various teaching positions. However, we don't just cater to the graduate students, we also pretty much have our services open to anyone who has an interest in education in the FSU community. So some of our services and events are used by faculty and staff. We have some postdoctoral scholars who like to come in and attend our events and trainings. We also have some non-teaching assistant graduate students who use our trainings to determine if they have an interest in teaching and if that's something that they want to pursue. So we offer a variety of services. We do year-round workshop series on various innovations in education and instructional design. We offer different networking opportunities for instructors to meet experts on these different topics in education. We do consultations. We have a lot of different free resources and job aids for teaching. But the item that we are perhaps most well known for at FSU is our mandatory teaching assistant training. So the TA training is something that pretty much all teaching assistants across the entire university have to take in order to fulfill that TA role. So each year we see anywhere from 800 to 1,000 of our teaching assistants at FSU from all different colleges attending our training. So specifically today, we have a couple of different training programs, but I am going to be focusing on what we call our Category 5 TA training. Now, TA roles at Florida State, it may be different at other institutions, but specifically at Florida State, they're divided into different categories based on the degree of the responsibility that that particular TA takes on. So categories 1 and 2, for example, that might be a TA who is doing grading, and that's their main task for an undergraduate level class and so on. So we have training that covers categories 1 through 4. It's one training program that has been in place for many years, but a brand new TA designation was introduced at Florida State a couple of years ago called Category 5. Now, what Category 5 entails is a teaching assistant who is performing faculty supervised grading and feedback writing and some limited faculty supervised teaching in a graduate level class. So you can imagine a graduate student coming into a graduate level class and taking on teaching responsibilities. That presents a variety of different challenges that we like to make sure that our instructors are trained on. When this designation was introduced, we had a very, very short timeline for implementing it. It actually was introduced a semester earlier than we originally thought. So I believe we had about 2 months to analyze what we needed to create the training, develop the content, and then implement and evaluate everything. So a very, very small timeline for getting this training program done that would be servicing TAs really from all across the university. So in order to keep us on track, utilizing a model of instructional design I found was very, very useful. It gave us a process that we could follow and kept us track on at all times so that we didn't fall behind in the process. And the ultimate goal really of all our training programs was to ensure that there was a high transfer of the knowledge and skills learned in this teacher education training to the actual TA role. So the model that I decided to use throughout the process was, of course, the IDN model, a very, very useful foundational model in instructional design. And we'll start out talking about the analysis phase and what that looked like in this design process. So during the analysis phase, we're of course analyzing various things about the projects, and probably the first and really most influential thing we had to look at was the constraints we were dealing with for this particular project. This was crucial because these constraints impacted really every other aspect of the design. And to list a few of these, I've already mentioned the small timeline. We also have a very small staff in our program. It is myself, our program director, and a graduate student who is only part-time and of course has limited access to various systems at the university. So really only 3 major staff working on this design project that we had a very small timeline to complete. So due to the constraints, this also meant that we had a very limited time to consult with our subject matter experts, find our resources, proofread and test the product. And we also did not have any additional budget for purchasing outside materials or software. So it was necessary, of course, to find what we already had, what we could utilize at FSU and adapt to our training purposes. So after figuring out what we were working with in terms of constraints, we focused on our target audience. That, of course, would be the Category 5 TAs. Now, these are TAs who have already been through some level of training, so they have some familiarity with core teaching policies, things like the academic honor policy and educational privacy, ADA, really important policies and laws like that. They also have knowledge of best practices in teaching, such as inclusive teaching, basic knowledge of the university learning management system, which for us is Canvas, things like that. So they're not starting out brand new. They do have a baseline of understanding teaching at FSU. After determining our target audience, we thought about our delivery options. Really, we only had one delivery option. I saw a really good question submitted for the webinar about, did we survey our audience to figure out how we would want the product to be delivered? In this case, we were very fortunate that the option we were restricted to for delivery was actually the most popular one, the one they seemed to best thrive with, and that is online and asynchronous. So again, we were using the Canvas learning management system to deliver the training content entirely asynchronously. So upon determining these details, we then moved on to our subject matter expert consultation. Due to that limited time frame, we had really a very large pool of individuals we could talk to at FSU, various professors who we knew would give fantastic feedback on what they felt was important for their TAs to learn. But we needed to find our most high priority experts on that Category 5 TA role so that we could get their input. What we determined was that we would go with the professors who intended to have the largest volume of these Category 5 TAs in their departments. So we got those together. Thankfully, they were from a good variety of different fields. We had some from STEM, some who were from humanities fields, some from more fine arts fields. And based on a long conversation and meeting with them, we all worked together to brainstorm what are the major skills that these Category 5 TAs need to know in order to thrive in that graduate level classroom. And also things like, how does the Category 5 TA work with that faculty member that's supervising them? What are the skills and the techniques that they should walk away from the training having learned in order to be successful in that very specific, very unique role at the university? After analyzing all of the information from our meeting with the subject matter experts, we then determined our learning outcomes. So based on the conversation, we determined that the most important skills would be things like conflicts of interest and how to avoid and manage those as a Category 5 TA, strategies for effective communication and professionalism as a TA, both online and as an in-person teacher. Giving effective feedback and mentoring of specifically graduate level students. That was a big one because different departments have different rules on that, but there are some sort of rules of thumb that they can walk away with pertaining to how to really give that helpful feedback to their students. We also trained them on various practical skills in teaching that we handled in a panel manner so that people were able to choose which topics were most interesting and most relevant to them, rather than, for example, hosting sort of a catch-all how to engage your students lesson, and that was very, very well received. So upon determining the learning outcomes, we then sat down to figure out our timeline and logistics. Now, this was a very key phase of this project. A colleague once shared the idea with me that when you're tackling large projects or events like this, it can be very easy to make sure that the major components go smoothly. So for example, I probably won't forget to upload all of the materials or make sure that all of the quizzes and essay assignments are ready to go. But it can be easy to let the small logistical details go awry without that proper planning and making sure that you have this timeline set up and you know exactly who is doing what phase of the process. In our case, we're responsible for just about every part of this. We design the training, but we also handle getting announcements out to all the departments at Florida State. We handle all of the surveying, all of the evaluation process, and making sure that TAs are properly registered and understanding the instructions. So again, making sure that that is built into the timeline and delegated to people on your team is really, really helpful for ensuring that everything goes smoothly. So moving on to the next phase, the design phase of the ADDIE model. I tend to use throughout the design and both design and development phases of the ADDIE model I like to use the Quality Matters rubric to inform a lot of my design decisions and as a quality assurance tool for anyone who may be unfamiliar with Quality Matters. It's a very, very helpful rubric for ensuring that you have very high quality online learning that is well aligned with your learning objectives, engaging to your learners, and also very well supported in terms of accessibility and tech support and things like that. So I absolutely love using that rubric for really any training that I develop. It's so helpful for making sure that I have ticked all of the boxes and can deliver a high quality product. Based on our learning outcomes that we established, we created specific learning objectives. As I mentioned, the learning objectives covered topics such as conflicts of interest, communication and professionalism, giving effective feedback and mentoring, and reflecting on practical tips from experienced TAs. Then we moved on based on our learning objectives, made sure they were measurable and very clear, not too vague or open to interpretation. We moved on to creating our assessments. We created a mixture of qualitative and quantitative assessments. This was a phase where we thought really a lot about what we would have the bandwidth as a staff to deliver, because we definitely didn't want to give them anything that felt like busy work. But we also knew we had a limited time to get all of the grading done and then get that certification information submitted so that they could begin their jobs. So we focused on using Canvas new quizzes because a lot of those can be just automatically graded, as well as short essay assignments. And the short essay assignments were actually pretty helpful. We got a lot of good reports from our TAs who engaged with those assignments because the prompts essentially asked them to plan for their upcoming role. They were very reflective in nature. They would ask, okay, how do you plan to incorporate these techniques for managing your time and communicating regularly with your faculty supervisor? So they didn't feel so much like busy work to our trainees because they were, again, directly applicable and went toward their planning for that job role. We also spent some time planning where we would get our content from, and we kind of purposefully overestimated how much content we would bring in. What I mean by that is that we got a few more sources of content than we needed because we felt that if one of them fell through or didn't work out in some way, we would have more sources of content to fall back on. And that ended up actually being a good idea because we did have one that didn't end up working out for us, but we still had plenty to utilize for the training despite that. And lastly, we spent a lot of time planning the interface of the Canvas course shell. It's really important to devote ample time in your project timeline, I believe, to organizing the content and conducting some degree of usability testing. Especially in our case, we were utilizing that asynchronous modality without a live facilitator to walk trainees through the learning management system. So it was very crucial that we create a course shell that was intuitive in its layout and filled with a variety of technology support resources. So if we circle back to my point I made earlier about making sure those seemingly small logistics are considered in the planning process, this is one of those details that I think can be easy to minimize, because when you have a design that you're working on, you as the designer, it may seem intuitive to you, but taking on the time to delegate to other members of your team and have them go through your interface and make sure it makes sense really helps a lot, because it could save you a lot of troubleshooting, a lot of answering questions for learners if they get confused by the layout. So on our key techniques, before we do move on to implementation, I mentioned delegation briefly, and I think with projects like these, knowing how you plan to divide up the work and having those clear deadlines and progress reports among your staff is really important, especially when you're on a very short timeline, to make absolutely certain that you stay on track. My graduate assistant was really an invaluable worker in this project, because although the assistant had limited hours, for example, and didn't have access to a lot of the same systems, they could be my usability tester. And that was absolutely key to making sure, having that proofreading, testing all of the content links, making sure that the layout makes sense. That was very, very helpful. We've already talked a little bit about identifying the most relevant subject matter experts, and how in this case it was those faculty and staff who had a large number of Category 5 TAs. Also considering what learners already know can save a lot of time in the design process, making sure that you don't include content that they're already familiar with. Avoid reinventing the wheel. That's something talking to colleagues and collaborators, a lot of our campus partners we find already have these amazing resources that sometimes aren't being used as much as they might like them to be. So we had so many of our partners who were willing to collaborate with us, share content, create videos on these different topics. So that was really helpful, was working with our partners across the university to do this. And finally, I find choosing your tools and technology carefully is something very important to consider. I like to use the technology acceptance model for this process. If you're unfamiliar with that, the idea behind the technology acceptance model is that successful use and implementation of a piece of technology tends to be dependent on learners' perceived usefulness of that technology. So for example, how do they think that piece of technology is going to help them reach their goal, in this case, their learning goal, and also their perceived ease of use of the technology. So do they think they will be able to learn it? Will it be too complicated and get in the way of their learning? Things like that. So that was something we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what tools would work best in this asynchronous format and wouldn't be too complicated, but also not too easy or boring for the trainees to utilize. So moving on to development, we took some time, as I mentioned, learning with our campus partners and collaborating on those various materials that we needed. And we identified two major sources during the design phase. So colleagues from our related offices, they, like I said, provided some of their resources and job aids that they were willing to share. We also relied very heavily on open educational resources. I saw quite a few questions on OER. Just for anyone who may be unfamiliar, briefly, open educational resources are these openly licensed educational materials that are really a huge asset to educators and instructional designers, because they tend to be a little bit more open in terms of licensing. A lot of them are Creative Commons license, so you can use and adapt them to your instructional purposes without having to worry so much about copyright. So as I mentioned, this screenshot here is from OER Commons. If this is something you're interested in as an instructional designer or as an educator, I highly recommend this resource. It gives you content from so many different fields on many different topics that in many cases you are able to adapt and use for your own educational purposes. Interface development during this process, again, we use Canvas. We focused a lot on the organization, making sure it made sense, making sure there were precise instructions. That's really, really important with asynchronous content, because you won't always be there to troubleshoot and guide your trainees through the process. And then, of course, we finalized all of the assessments that we have drafted within the Canvas learning management system. And we utilized Canvas new quizzes and the short essay tool within the system. Now, a few key techniques from this phase. Whenever you might feel like the training is a little bit short, I definitely suggest having some optional supplemental materials, because this can give your trainees, if they're interested, a deeper dive into whatever the topic is without overwhelming them with too much material to go through. It also helps sometimes if you have supplemental materials that are in different modalities, because maybe for the required materials, maybe they went through the reading and they didn't understand it as much as they would like to. If you have videos in your supplemental materials, then that gives them another modality to go through and learn from, and that may help clarify the content for them. Experimenting with sandbox platforms, we're very fortunate to have regular access to Canvas sandbox sites so that we can play around with different design decisions, we can test technology, we can do all of these things without having to worry that it's going to adversely affect the official training site. For a lot of these learning management systems as well, when you have a design that you like within your sandbox site, you can take it and import it directly into the official Canvas site, which is very, very helpful and can save a lot of time. And of course, we placed a lot of focus on the quality for our learners. We use those multiple mediums for our materials in line with principles of universal design for learning. And we use the accessibility tools that are embedded within the Canvas learning management system to make sure that the materials and the assessments were accessible to our learners. And finally, we get to the exciting implementation phase. So right before we launched the official training, we took some time to just make absolutely certain all of our instructions were correct and consistent. We made sure that we had all of our various support contacts and how-to guides uploaded, even taking the time to make sure you've linked your learners to tech support within an online training can really help them and make sure they know who to go to if they're having problems with the training interface itself. We prepared all of our announcements and first step instructions, conducted one final proofread, and then of course, we still thankfully had built in time in our timeline to those logistics such as processing all the registration data and assembling those launch emails. Finally, we got to our evaluation phase once the trainees were done going through the training program. In our case, we utilized Qualtrics survey software. That's what we have free access to as FSU employees. And it is fairly user-friendly and allows for us to utilize various different items. We can get qualitative information from them as well as quantitative. So we took time to design our evaluation items. Of course, we utilized a combination of short answer questions where they could tell us specifically what they liked about the training, what they felt could be improved, and what they would like to see in the future. And of course, we had those Likert scale items where they could let us know how we did in terms of numerical scores. We created thorough instructions for our evaluation and determined the ideal launch time. For us, it tended to be a little bit after they've already gone through the training, gotten their scores, and determined their certification status. I think as a rule of thumb, that can be a good time to launch your evaluation because they're done worrying about the actual training itself and the outcome of that training and can focus on giving you that good evaluation. So upon analyzing the results, I have a few major takeaways for this. I think I did see a few questions about this for the webinar as well. Gathering a substantial sample for your evaluation can be very, very challenging. And unfortunately, I don't have a catch-all solution to this. We also sometimes experience trouble getting participants to engage with the evaluation, but there are a few things that I have found seem to be effective. One, of course, is making it anonymous. They do appreciate the chance to share their honest opinion without worrying about being identified. Circulating it multiple times also usually helps because sometimes they might have missed the first round of evaluation, but when they see it in the future, they're usually willing to engage with the survey. And then also making sure that you actually take time to consider and possibly implement some of their suggestions. We conduct for our training sessions, we have actually information sessions before the trainings are launched that are specifically for the faculty and staff that are working with our TAs and trying to make sure that they do their training. And during those sessions, we explain how the training works, what the trainees need to do, and we also talk about what changes have we made over the years that are driven by this data. And we tend to get a lot of positive reactions from the trainees and the faculty when we talk about, okay, these are things that were suggested to us by real users of this training product, and these are the things that we implemented based on that feedback. So they really do like and appreciate seeing that their suggestions are considered and taken seriously. But during that feedback analysis, I do have just a couple simple tips. One of those is it's okay to be nervous. I get nervous pretty much every time I look at our evaluation data. And it's important to remember that you likely cannot please all of your consumers, and that's okay. You will sometimes find that some of the harsher ones may stand out to you, but you can get really so much helpful data. You can get really good constructive criticism as well as good input about what worked really well in your training. If you do find yourself getting defensive about a certain piece of criticism, it's helpful to take a break, really consider it, decide if it's something that can be implemented into the training or something that might not be helpful, and then come back to it. Examining multiple sources of feedback is also really crucial for us. We have that official evaluation survey, but I also made note of like live interactions that I had with some of the trainees who told me how they felt about the training. We had some trainees who actually wrote in their essays things that they specifically really enjoyed about the training. Those are all sources of feedback that, even though not all of them are formal, they are still very helpful and may be helpful to record and then keep for future purposes. Noting both your strengths and your weaknesses, so you know what to retain and what to improve, is important. And then lastly, of course, both quantitative and qualitative data are valuable. So it's great to have those numbers, of course, for your end of the year reports on how your program is doing, but it's also good to know why the trainees rated it a certain way. So quickly going over the final training product and what it actually looked like. We concluded with 5 major asynchronous modules. The content covers core teaching policy. That is an optional module, and the reason we choose to include this each year is because some TAs have a bit of a gap from that first major teaching training they take to when they become a Category 5 TA. So for those learners specifically, we do make sure we keep updated information about policy at the university so that they can review it if they need to. But if the trainees have just taken that other training, then they don't really need to go through that content again. Conflicts of interest, that one is very popular among the Category 5 TAs because it goes through very specific scenarios of what they need to look for and how to identify what is a conflict of interest in the classroom versus what is not. Communication and professionalism, that one they find very helpful for giving them specific strategies of how to work with a faculty member, how to send emails both to students and to their fellow graduate students who they may be working with in the classroom and their faculty member supervisor. We give them a lot of practical tips so that they can perform these logistical parts of their job very efficiently. Giving effective feedback and mentoring, this one provides them actually with a lot of job aids that they can take directly into the classroom. Some of the job aids, for example, go through tutoring practices that they can give and study skills that they can give directly to their students if they're having a student in the class who's struggling with the course and might need a little bit of information on how to properly study for it and go through practice. And then finally, of course, we have those practical teaching tips from experienced TAs across fields. What that specifically entailed is we, like I mentioned earlier, did not want to have a general how to engage your learners session, because what works for somebody in fine arts, for example, may be completely different from a TA who's in a STEM class. So we try to catch as many of those as we can by recruiting a team of volunteers, of experienced TAs at the university who go on video and they create a short 3 to 5 minute video where they talk about what worked in terms of active learning in their field specifically. There are a bunch of different topics that the trainees can choose from. They're only required to choose one and write a short reflection on what they found helpful about the tip and how they intend to implement it in the future. And that one has received a lot of good feedback because pretty much everyone found something that they felt was very applicable to their specific role in their discipline. The materials that the TAs use to go through these different modules are a combination of short readings, videos that did different demonstrations, and job aids actually that they could take from the training and bring directly into their role in the classroom if they wanted to. And finally, as I've mentioned, the assessments were the auto-graded quizzes. The quizzes were essentially to make sure that they knew really core information, often about policy that they would need to know on the spot in the position, as well as to make sure that they had gone through and were aware of where to find all of these materials that they could use in their teaching, while the essays were focused on planning for their job. So these are just a couple of key techniques that we've been through for the entire process. Having that model or process to keep you on track doesn't necessarily have to be the ADDIE model. It could be a variety of instructional design models depending on your preference. But for us, it was very, very helpful for making sure we were on track and going through the timeline in an efficient manner as a team. Identifying our constraints as soon as possible and prioritizing was also crucial. Avoiding reinventing the wheel in terms of content development and utilizing OER. OER really is a truly powerful resource, and I've linked a Google site on the slides, which I believe you will all have access to later. The site is a repository of open educational resources that are designed to teach teachers and instructional designers about open educational resources. So they're open to you, and they teach you how to actually go about creating and adapting OER for your classroom. So please do feel free to use that resource. It's very, very helpful. And then to finish out a couple of these, collecting as much feedback as possible from different sources, noting strengths and reflecting on the why behind different design decisions you make before you revise can be helpful. And then being aware of design decision biases as you go through your feedback and consider that constructive criticism from your trainees. I won't take too much time to go through this. This is just a helpful graphic that I found that I thought was useful for when there is some sort of design mistake or hiccup throughout your process. I think these questions are very, very useful for going back and reflecting and correcting in the future. All right, so I think we have a little bit of time for questions. So let me take a look at the chat here.